Hello, friends. I hope you're fine and sitting comfortably. Then I'll begin. All right. Today I want to read the first chapter of the following book. Let me share the front cover. Um, there we are. Japanese Studies in Britain, a Survey and History, edited by Hugh Cortazzi and Peter Kornicki. Uh, and I've already read the preface by Sir Hugh Cortazzi, and I think it was called a preface, not a forward or anything like that. Anyway, I've read the opening remarks by him, and so today the plan is to read chapter one by Peter Kornicki. Uh, I probably won't read beyond that. The Japan Society would probably prefer I didn't anyway, as I understand things. But anyway, it will give you a good idea of what's in the book, or should do, if I read properly, which I certainly intend to. Okay, so if I now share the PDF of the text there, and it's time to begin. 1. A brief history of Japanese studies in Britain from the 1860s to the 21st century, Peter Kornicki. The core of this book shows how the study of Japan has developed in a number of British universities, but almost all of that development took place after the Second World War. Before the war, the study of Japan, such as it was spread very thinly and achieved most of its successes in terms of research and publication outside the universities. Although it is of course true that the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, began teaching Japanese in 1917, in the entire pre-war period, only 2 students graduated with degrees in Japanese, one in 1938 and the other in 1939. On the other hand, many others took short courses, including Army and Navy officers, and the foundations of the university teaching of Japanese in Britain were laid down at SOAS. The fact is, however, that few undergraduates were drawn to the study of the Japanese language before the war, even though the history of the flourishing Japan Society, founded in London in 1891, shows that there was already a lot of interest in Japan. A small number of British men and women acquired a good knowledge of Japanese in Japan over the subsequent decades, but after 1941, wartime requirements dramatically transformed the need for and the value of people with a reliable knowledge of the language, and this led to the introduction of accelerated courses to increase the supply. Many of those whose introduction to Japanese and the study of Japan came about in this way went on to play a fundamental role in the development of Japanese studies in the universities after the war. This chapter will present an overview from the beginnings in the 19th century up to the present day, taking into account changes in government policy and examining the prospects for the future. There is a note there. I think it's an end note, which is not so. Oh, no, it's a footnote. Okay, so there are footnotes. All right, we'll look at that when we get to the bottom of the page then. Before 1941, William Adams, 1564 to 1620, thought to have been the first English person to visit Japan, seems to have learnt to speak Japanese during his long residence in Japan from 1600 to his death 1620, but it is highly unlikely that he learnt to read Japanese, that is, and no clear sign of his Japanese literacy survives. Much the same is true of Richard Cox, 1566 to 1624, and his colleagues at Hirado, where the East India Company operated a trading post from 1613 up to its closure in 1623. None of them studied the language like the Portuguese Jesuit, João Rodrigues, who published his grammar of Japanese in Nagasaki in the first decade of the 17th century. The first British citizens to acquire a thorough command of written and spoken Japanese were, therefore, members of that intrepid band who went out to Japan in the closing days of the Tokugawa Bakufu and the early years of Meiji Japan. The best known of those early scholars of Japan are Sir Ernest Mason Satow, 1843 to 1929, and William George Aston, 1841 to 1911, who first went to Japan in 1861 and 1864, respectively. Yes, Satow left England for Japan in 1861. He didn't arrive until 1862, September. Maybe that's what the footnote says. Okay, let's take a look at the footnotes. For other valuable accounts of the history of Japanese studies in Britain, see Frank J. Daniels, Japanese Studies in the University of London and Elsewhere, an inaugural lecture delivered on the 7th of November 1962, London School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, 1963. Ian Nish, The Growth of Japanese Studies in Britain, Jose Occasional Papers 6, 1989, pages 1 to 12. Introducing Japanese Studies in Britain in J. W. M. Chapman edited European Association for Japanese Studies, 1973 to 88. Ripe, East Sussex, Saltire House Publications Society, 1988, pages 52 to 57. And Japanese Studies in Britain in Ewing Brown edited Japanese Studies, London, British Library, 1990. And note number two, Peter Kornicki, William George Aston, 1841 to 1911, and Ernest Mason Satow, 1843 to 1929, in Hugh Cortazzi and Gordon Daniels, edited Britain and Japan, 1859 to 1991, Themes and Personalities, London, Routledge, 1991, pages 64 to 75 and 76 to 85. Yes, I found Peter Kornicki's chapters on Aston and particularly Satow very useful when I was beginning my Satow research. In the true Japanese sense of the word, he's a sensei, a person who goes first. He went first in studies of Ernest Satow, as far as I'm concerned, and I learned a lot from him. Thank you. All right, so continuing the main text, as student interpreters, this is talking about Satow and Aston. As student interpreters in the Japan Consular Service, their first job was to learn the language, and they both subsequently became pioneers in Japanese bibliography and other fields. Aston wrote grammars of the spoken and written languages, which went through several editions each as he gradually gained a better understanding of the language. Aston and Satow were not alone, however. Even before them, Sir Rutherford Alcock, 1809 to 1897, who was Britain's first resident diplomatic officer in Japan as Consul General in Edo from 1858 to 1864, used the opportunity to study the language and explore Japanese art, publishing Elements of Japanese Grammar for the Use of Beginners, 1861, and Art and Art Industries in Japan, 1878. By 1867, Trubner and Company, the booksellers of Paternoster Row in London, had not only published two new works by Alcock, his Practical Grammar of the Japanese Language and Familiar Dialogues in Japanese, but also had on sale in London several Japanese-English dictionaries published in Japan, and remarkably even some 38 books and maps written in Japanese and imported from Japan in woodblock printed editions. These included The Tale of the Heike, an illustrated version of the story of the 47 Ronin, Ehon Chushin Gura, and an illustrated account of the sights of Edo, Edo Meisho Zue. The Romanized transcriptions of the titles in Trubner's lists are much mangled, so it is difficult to imagine that Trubner might have been selling to the small number of Japanese resident in London in 1867, but if not them, then whom? Aston and Satow, oh, by the way, I'm pronouncing Satow with a long A as Sir Hugh used to. That's the way I take it that it should be pronounced. Aston and Satow were followed by many other members of the Japan Consular Service. One of them was John Harrington Gubbins, 1852 to 1929, who served in various British consulates in Japan from 1871 to 1908, and was in 1909 appointed lecturer in Japanese at the University of Oxford. He translated the Civil Code of Japan into English and wrote several books on the recent history of Japan. Another was Sir George Sansom, 1883 to 1965, who, And that goes to the next page. So let's take a look at the footnotes. Number 3, referring to Alcock's books, I think it is, yes. Hugh Kornitski, Sir Rutherford Alcock, the first British Minister to Japan, 1859 to 1864, a reassessment. Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, TASJ, as we call it. Fourth series, 9, 1994, pages 1 to 42. And the next is a reference relating to number 4. What's number 4? Edo Meisho Zue, is that? Yes, all right. So Trubner's American and Oriental Literary Record, 31st of January 1867, page 391, and 15th of May 1967, page 21. I'm grateful to my wife, Francesca Orsini, for having drawn Trubner's monthly record to my attention. Oh, okay. And number 5, so this is talking about Gubbins, isn't it? Yes. So Ian Nish, John Harrington Gubbins, an old Japan hand, 1871 to 1908, and J.E. Hoare, Britain's Japan Consular Service, 1859 to 1941, in Hugh Kornitski edited British Envoys in Japan, 1859 to 1972, Folkestone, Global Oriental, 2004, pages 241 to 249, 260 to 268. Gubbins wrote The Progress of Japan, 1853 to 1871, Oxford Clarendon Press, 1911, and this footnote goes on to the next page, just a minute, get that, and The Making of Modern Japan, an account of the progress of Japan from pre-feudal days to constitutional government and the position of a great power with chapters on religion, the complex family system, education, etc. London, Seeley Service, 1922. Same publisher as Sir Ernest Satow's A Diplomat in Japan, by the way. Seeley Service. Okay, so let's continue with the main text. Another was Sir George Sansom, 1883 to 1965, who spent most of his career in the Japan Consular Service from 1904 to 1935, apart from the years of the First World War. By 1935, he had published an historical grammar of Japanese and Japan, a short cultural history, and he was the first scholar diplomat to teach on Japan at university level, albeit not in Britain. He taught at Columbia University in New York before and after the Second World War. During the war itself, he was attached to the British Embassy in Washington as an expert on Japan. Footnote 6 there. Few of the diplomats, as opposed to members of the Japan Consular Service who served in the British Embassy in Tokyo before the outbreak of the Second World War, became serious scholars of Japan. One exception was Sir Ernest Satow, who had transferred from the Japan Consular Service to the Diplomatic Service, but there was also Sir Charles Eliot, 1862 to 1931, whose major study of Japanese Buddhism was published posthumously in 1935. Yes. Eliot was an old Cheltonian, as I am, a former pupil of Cheltenham College. In 1872, the Asiatic Society of Japan was founded in Tokyo, and the regular meetings of the society provided a forum for British and other residents of Japan to engage seriously with the culture and history of Japan. The early volumes of the Transactions of the Society contain many British contributions and testify to the considerable number of British residents of Japan who had acquired a good knowledge of Japan and Japanese. Some of them were missionaries like the Reverend Professor Arthur Lloyd, 1852 to 1911, who reached Japan in 1884 and remained there until his death. In addition to studies of Japanese Buddhism, he also published in 1917 a translation of Ozaki Koyo's sensational novel Konjiki Yasha under the title The Gold Demon. Appears to be a posthumous publication, is it? Yes. Other missionaries who engaged in the study of Japan include Walter Denning, 1846 to 1913, who wrote The Life of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1888, and other works, and who was, and the next page, that's the next page there, but have a quick look at the footnotes. Footnote number 6, Gordon Daniels, Sir George Sansom, preeminent diplomat and historian in Kornitski edited British Envoys in Japan, 1859 to 1972, pages 250 to 259. Number 7, Dennis Smith, Sir Charles Eliot, Ambassador to Japan, 1919 to 1925, in Kortatsi edited British Envoys in Japan, 1859 to 1972, pages 114 to 122. And footnote 8, number 8, Douglas Moore Kenrick, A Century of Western Studies of Japan, the First 100 Years of the Asiatic Society of Japan, 1872 to 1972, Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, TASJ, third series, volume 14, 1978. All right, so I'll just reread the final sentence of the main text of this page. Other missionaries who engaged in the study of Japan include Walter Denning, 1846 to 1913, who wrote The Life of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1888, and other works, and who was the father of Sir Esler Denning, 1897 to 1977, the first British ambassador to Japan after the Second World War, and John Batchelor, 1855 to 1944, who lived in Hokkaido from 1877 to 1941 and was a pioneer scholar of Ainu language and culture. That's footnote 9. Many other missionaries became scholars of Japan, as Hamish Ion's contribution to this volume shows. Other important contributions came from Frederick Victor Dickins, 1838 to 1915, who spent 2 periods in Japan, firstly as a doctor and secondly as a lawyer, and was the first to write on hokusai in any language, and Basil Hall Chamberlain, 1850 to 1935, who was professor of Japanese at Tokyo Imperial University from 1886, and produced many pioneering studies of the languages and literature of Japan. Chamberlain was an oyatoi, a foreign employee of the Meiji government, and he was by no means the only one to use the opportunity to learn Japanese and take up the study of Japan. Yes, I've recently read part of Frederick Victor Dickins' work, translation, The Magic Carpenter, I think it is. Yes. All right. In the first half of the 20th century, the Army and Navy Language Officer Scheme, which came into operation in 1903, following the initiation of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, created a steady stream of capable officers with a good knowledge of Japanese, some of them staying for as long as 4 years in Japan. By 1922, 48 British Army officers, 2 Royal Air Force officers, and from 1906 onwards, 29 Indian Army officers had spent at least 1 year in Japan studying the language. An unknown number of Royal Naval officers had also studied in Japan. So now we have the footnotes for this page. Number 9, Hamish Ion, or Ion, I'm not quite sure. Walter Denning, 1846 to 1913, and Japan, in Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, hereafter referred to as BJBP. Volume 7, Folkestone Global Oriental, 2010, pages 348 to 401. Roger Buckley, Sir Esler Denning, Ambassador to Japan, 1951 to 1957, in Kortatsi edited British Envoys in Japan, 1859 to 1972, pages 173 to 8. Kortatsi John Batchelor, missionary and friend of the Ainu, 1855 to 1945, in Ian Nish, edited BJBP, Volume 2, Richmond, Japan Library, 1997, pages 216 to 232. Yeah, Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits is a wonderful series. I think it went up to 10 volumes, and I contributed 3 or 4, I can't remember, papers to that, which became chapters. All right, so note number 10, Hamish Ion, Arthur Lloyd, 1852 to 1911, and Japan Dancing with Amida in Hugh Kortatsi, edited BJBP Volume 7, pages 402 to 419. I have also seen it abbreviated as Bioport, as in biographical portraits, by the way. Kornicki, Frederick Victor Dickins, 1838 to 1915, in J.E. Hoare, edited BJBP Volume 3, London Japan Library, 1999, pages 66 to 77. Richard Bowring, an amused guest in all, Basil Hall Chamberlain, 1850 to 1935, in Kortatsi and Daniels, edited Britain and Japan, 1859 to 1991, pages 128 to 136. 11. On the Oyatoi, the foreign employees, see E.R. Beecham and A. Irie, edited Foreign Employees in 19th Century Japan, Boulder, Colorado, Westview Press, 1990, and O. Checkland, that's Olive Checkland, Britain's Encounter with Meiji Japan, 1868 to 1912, London, Macmillan, 1989. For the Army, Indian Army and Royal Air Force officers up to 1922, see the list in Captain M.D. Kennedy, The Military Side of Japanese Life, London, Constable and Co. Company. And that appears to go on to the next page, does it? Sorry. That footnote goes on to the next page. Whoop, down we go. Yeah, limited. 1924, pages 357 to 359. Arrangements were put in place in 1904 for naval officers to pursue language training in Japan, and in 1905, Captain Jones of the Royal Marines Light Infantry and Oswald Tuck were already studying in Japan. See National Archives ADM 1/7728. Gubbins to Sir Claude MacDonald, 16th December 1904 and 10th of January 1904, which is a sick 1905, should be 1905. Okay. All right. Let's go back to the previous page and finish it again. Link it to, yeah. Okay. So talking about Royal Naval officers, an unknown number of Royal Naval officers had also studied in Japan. And then on the next page, page 8, the number of RAF officers is low because before 1918, when the RAF was formed, officers in the Royal Flying Corps counted as army officers. One of them, however, spent the years 1905 to 1907 in Japan and was later to become Air Chief Marshal Sir Geoffrey Salmond, KCMG DSO. One of the first group who arrived in 1903 was Major Charles Yate, 1872 to 1914, who spent 3 years in Japan. He died on the 20th of September 1914 while in captivity and won the Victoria Cross. He was one of 8 former language officers to die in the First World War. Note 13. Captain Kennedy, who was himself a language officer and wrote a number of books on Japan, records that in 1917, 6 officers were selected to undergo a preliminary course at the School of Oriental Studies, as SOAS was then called. No African in the title at the time, and that as a result of an examination, he and one other officer were sent out to Japan. He spent the years 1917 to 1920 in Japan, and later had an important part to play in the training of young men and women for work at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. After the First World War, the language officer program continued. Between 1922 and 1939, when the program was terminated, owing to the outbreak of war in Europe, at least 22 British Army officers, 10 Indian Army officers, 10 Royal Navy officers, 8 Royal Air Force officers, and 2 Royal Australian Navy officers had taken part. The language officers spent the first year on intensive language work with a private teacher, but in subsequent years, while continuing their studies, they also spent time attached to units of the Japanese Army if they were officers of, and it goes to the next page, but let's take a look at the footnotes. Number 13. On the reverse of the title page of the work cited in the previous note, Kennedy reproduces the text of a tablet to the memory of the 8 and of one who died in 1919 that was unveiled in St Andrew's Church in Tokyo in 1922 by the Prince of Wales. The church was destroyed by bombing in 1945. On Yate, see Yahya Shaigia Abel Samad, Major C.A.L. Yate, V.C., 1872 to 1914, a gallant British officer and admirer of Japan. In Kortatsi, edited BJBP, Volume 9, Folkestone Renaissance Books, 2015, pages 524 to 530. Footnote 14, Kennedy, The Military Side of Japanese Life, page 3. 15, see the tables in Anthony Best, British Intelligence and the Japanese Challenge in Asia, 1914 to 1941, Basingstoke, Hampshire. Palgrave Macmillan, 2002, pages 94 to 95, 108. Not all completed their studies, and not only those who arrived in 1939. Right, so I'm going to start the end of the main text of this page again. The language officers spent the first year on intensive language work with a private teacher, but in subsequent years, while continuing their studies, they also spent time attached to units of the Japanese Army if they were officers of the British or Indian armies. Note 16. A few of them later in their career became military or naval attachés. 2 of their most significant attachés in terms of the development of Japanese studies were Captain Oswald Tuck, RN, Royal Navy, 1876 to 1950, and Major General Francis Pigott, 1883 to 1966, another old Chiltonian. Tuck was summoned out of retirement in 1942 to teach Japanese at the Inter-Service Special Intelligence School in Bedford, while Pigott taught on the SOAS courses during the war. The language officer who made the most important contributions to scholarship was undoubtedly Major Charles Boxer, 1904 to 2000. He was sent to Japan in 1930 and in 1933 qualified as an army Japanese interpreter. Between 1937 and 1941, he was a member of the Far East Combined Bureau, a British intelligence organization in Hong Kong that monitored Japanese wireless traffic. After the capture of Hong Kong, he became a prisoner of war and remained in captivity until 1945. His academic career began in 1951 when SOAS appointed him as its first professor of the history of the Far East, and in the same year his famous study of the Christian century in Japan, 1549 to 1650, was published. There were many others who lived in Japan in the first half of the 20th century and learnt Japanese to a high level. Sir Robert Craigie, 1883 to 1959, who was British ambassador in Japan from 1937 to 1941, wrote several reports in early 1941 on the availability of Britons with a good knowledge of Japanese to meet the needs of the authorities in Singapore, India, Ceylon, and Burma, who were pressing him for people to act as interpreters or censors of posts and telegraphs. He could only come up with 40 names, half of whom were missionaries. 4 were employees of the Rising Sun Petroleum Company, now Showa Seikyu, which required employees to learn Japanese, and 4 were teachers, including Frank Daniels. Okay, now we've got the footnotes for this page 9. Footnote 16, Kennedy, the military side of Japanese life, pages 25 to 28. James Weymouth, pseudonym, the language officer in Japan, United Services Magazine, 1030, 1914, pages 646 to 650. Footnote 17, C. Sue Jarvis, Captain Oswald Tuck, RN, 1876 to 1950, and the Bedford Japanese School in Hugh Kotatsi, edited BJBP, Volume 5, Folkestone Global Oriental, 2005, pages 196 to 208, and Carmen Blacker, 2 Pigotts, Sir Francis Taylor Pigott, 1952 to 1925, and Major General F.S.G. Pigott, 1883 to 1966, in Kotatsi and Daniels, edited Britain and Japan, 1859 to 1991, pages 118 to 227. Pigott Père, the father, was an employee of the Japanese government for many years as a legal expert to Ito Hirobumi and wrote on Japanese art and gardens. Okay, so just going back to the end of the main text of this page. He could only come up with 40 names, half of whom were missionaries. 4 were employees of the Rising Sun Petroleum Company, now Showa Seikyu, which required employees to learn Japanese, and 4 were teachers, including Frank Daniels, 1899 to 1983, and Frank Hawley, 1906 to 1961. Craigie deplored the shortage. This is a quotation from Craigie. It will be observed that the number of British subjects with the requisite knowledge of Japanese is comparatively small. I regard this development as very serious, both from the general point of view in times of emergency and also in connection with the future cultural and social relations between the two countries. There can be no doubt that a good knowledge of the Japanese language makes an incalculable difference to the understanding of this country. Hear, hear. Few though they may have been, some of them put their skills and knowledge to use as part of the war effort. One who did so was Frank Daniels, who was later to become the first professor of Japanese at SOAS. Daniels had taught English at Otaru Commercial High School, that's in Hokkaido, from 1933 and was succeeded there by Richard Storry, 1913 to 1982. Interesting that a high school should have played such a role. Who later, as an army major, commanded one of the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre, India, mobile sections in Burma during the war, and later taught at Oxford University and wrote on Japanese history. Another person whose knowledge of Japanese contributed to the war effort was Captain Martin, who had spent 3 years in Japan as superintendent of the Blue Funnel Line and later taught on the Japanese courses run in the naval section at Bletchley Park. Peter Kornicki has written a book about a lot of this, which Anyway, let's continue for now. British interest in Japan was, of course, by no means confined to the British community in Japan. The formation of the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902 seems to have stimulated growing interest in Japan, for in 1903, William Shand, 1850 to 1909, who had worked in banking and insurance in Yokohama for 27 years, opened a school of Japanese language and literature in London. By 1908, more than 70 students had passed through. I wonder that William Shand must be related to Alexander, is it Alexander Allen Shand? Satow's friend. Oh well. So footnote 18, Ronald Dore, Frank and Otomi Daniels in Ian Nish, edited BJBP Folkestone, Japan Library, 1994, pages 268 to 278. Manabu Yokoyama, Frank Hawley, 1906 to 1961, scholar, bibliophile and journalist in Kortatsi, edited BJBP, volume 5, pages 409 to 417. 19, footnote 19, that is. National Archives, FO 371/27953, 24th of March 1941, 26th of April 1941, April 1941. The quotation comes from his report to the Foreign Office of 26 April 1941. That's the quotation of Craigie, I think, at the top of the page, yeah. 20, footnote 20, Ian Nish, Richard Storry, 1913 to 1982, A Lifelong Affair with Japan in Kortatsi, edited BJPP, volume 5, pages 326 to 336. 21, National Archives, HW 851, H/51, H.R. Foss, The Origin and Developments of NSIJ, ND, page 19. Naval section, I suppose. Is that? Anyway, so by 1908, more than 70 students had passed through his hands. Whose hands is that? I think it was Frank. Was it Frank Daniels? No, it was William Shand, sorry. Nearly half of them were military officers who then proceeded to Japan under the language officer scheme, but there were also women intending to go to Japan as missionaries and assorted commercial and private students. Shand also published Japanese Self-Taught and Grammar, 1907, one of a number of books for learners published in London after 1902. The most well-known self-taught scholar of Japan between the wars in Britain was undoubtedly Arthur Waley, 1889 to 1966, whose translation of The Tale of Genji, 1921 to 1933, brought Japanese classical literature to the attention of literary circles in Britain for the first time. During the war, he worked in the Ministry of Information in London, which was based in the Senate House of the University of London. Well, sorry. I've just skipped. There we are. Throughout the early 20th century, an important venue for the study of Japan was the Japan Society, which was founded in 1891 during the International Congress of Orientalists held in London that year. Many of the scholar consular officials, such as Aston and Gubbins, became members, and the first chairman of the society was William Anderson, 1842 to 1900. Anderson had taught at the Imperial Naval Medical College in Tokyo from 1873 to 1880, and had continued to practice medicine in London while simultaneously filling the post of Professor of Anatomy at the Royal Academy of Art and publishing pioneering studies of Japanese art. The transactions and proceedings of the Japan Society preserve a valuable record of the papers read at the Society's meetings. Some of these were traveller's tales, but others were more serious, such as a lecture on translating No plays by Arthur Waley in 1920. This lecture was chaired by Marie Stopes, 1880 to 1958, who is famous as a birth control pioneer, but had also visited Japan and written on No Theatre. The Society was inevitably suspended in 1942, but resumed activities in 1949. So footnotes, number 22, Noboru Koyama, William J. S. Shand, 1850 to 1909, and Henry John Weinz, 1864 to 1931, Japanese Self-Taught, in Kortatsi, edited BJBP Volume 10, pages 362 to 370. Footnote 23, Philip Harries, Arthur Waley, 1899 to 1966, poet and translator, in Cortazzi and Daniels, edited Britain and Japan, 1859 to 1991, pages 214 to 222. Footnote 24, Hugh Cortazzi, The Japan Society, A Hundred-Year History, in Cortazzi and Daniels, edited Britain and Japan, 1859 to 1991, pages 1 to 53. Footnote 25, John Rawlins, William Anderson, 1842 to 1900, surgeon, teacher, and art collector, in Cortazzi, edited BJBP, Volume 5, pages 3 to 12. And footnote 26, Carmen Blacker, Marie Stopes, 1907 to 1958, and Japan, in Cortazzi and Daniels, Britain and Japan, 1859 to 1991, pages 157 to 165. The year 1907 was the year in which Stopes went to Japan, not the year of her birth. Okay. Right. Next page. Although it is certainly true that most expertise on Japan was before 1941 to be found outside the universities, a few universities had begun to show an interest in Japan. In Oxford, Gubbins had held a lectureship in Japanese from 1909 to 1912, and Frederick Victor Dickins was made reader in Japanese at the University of Bristol, but in neither case were undergraduate courses in Japanese given. When Ernest Satow wrote to the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University in 1912 to express his delight that his books had found a home in Cambridge, he wrote that he hoped the university would in due course start teaching Japanese history and literature, but he added that the language is of no examination value. More active as a teacher than either of these was Joseph Henry Longford, 1849 to 1925, who, like Gubbins, was a former member of the Japan Consular Service. He served as Professor of Japanese at King's College London from 1902 to 1916. From the late 19th century onwards, there had been a succession of committees, reports, and public statements calling for a school of Oriental languages in Britain. The most significant of these had been the report of a committee appointed by the Treasury and chaired by Lord Reay to consider the organisation of Oriental studies in London, which was published in 1909. Satow had in fact given evidence to that committee and expressed himself in favour of the teaching of Japanese history, civilization, and religion. However, it was not until 1916 that the recommendations of the Reay Committee were finally acted upon, and the School of Oriental Studies, as it was initially called, was inaugurated. I'm pronouncing it Reay because it is written R-E-A-Y, Lord Reay, but it might be Lord Ray for all I know. Okay, so we've got footnotes here. Number 27, Cambridge University Library Archives, Library Syndicate, Appendix to Minutes, 1909 to 1919, Satow to Vice-Chancellor, 30th of October 1912. 28, Ian Ruxton, Joseph Henry Longford, 1849 to 1925, Consul and Scholar, in Hugh Cortazzi, edited BJBP, Volume 6, Folkestone Global Oriental, 2007, pages 307 to 314. Footnote 29, report of the committee appointed by the Lords Commissioners of His Majesty's Treasury to consider the organisation of Oriental Studies in London. London, HMSO, His Majesty's Stationery Office, 1909. On previous efforts, see P.J. Hartog, The Origins of the School of Oriental Studies, Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, 1/1/1917, pages 5 to 22. Footnote 30, report of the committee appointed by the Lords Commissioners of His Majesty's Treasury, pages 69 and 73. Next page of the main text. In response to the opening of the school, an article in The Spectator lamented the fact that it came many years after similar institutions had been established in various European countries. It is indeed little short of a public scandal that whilst for a long time past Germany, Austria, France, Russia, and Italy have possessed establishments where Oriental languages are taught, Great Britain, with her 350 millions of Asiatic and African subjects and her huge trade with the East, involving a turnover of more than 200 millions a year, should have lagged behind and should not long ago have established any adequate system for instructing British administrative and commercial agents in either the languages, customs, religions, or history of the populations with whom they were destined to be brought in contact. This was not the first time that provision in Britain was to be compared unfavourably with that in other countries. It is worth remembering at this juncture that Johann Josef Hoffmann, 1805 to 1878, had been appointed to a chair of Chinese and Japanese at Leiden University, in 1855, that Antelmo Severini, 1827 to 1909, had been appointed professor of Far Eastern languages at the Scuola Regia in Florence in 1863, and that Léon de Rosny, 1837 to 1914, had been appointed professor of Japanese at the École des Langues Orientales in Paris in 1868. In 1916, Britain certainly was behind. Japanese was offered consistently at the School of Oriental Studies from 1917 onwards, as Andrew Gerstl's essay in this volume shows. As in the case of many of the other courses offered by the school before the Second World War, however, few students were following degree courses, although many took short courses. It was then, at the outbreak of the Pacific War in 1941, that transformed the study of Japan in Britain, and that in turn had a profound impact upon the development of university courses in Japanese in post-war Britain. Footnotes. Number 31, The School of Oriental Studies, The Spectator, 16th of June, 1916, page 8. That's the quotation at the top of the page. 32, Ivo Smits, Japanese Studies in the Netherlands, in Leonard Blusse, Wilhelm Remmelink and Smits, edited, Bridging the Divide, 400 Years of the Netherlands-Japan, Leiden Hote, 2000, page 241. Adolfo Tamburello, Japanese Studies in Italy, the Japan Foundation Newsletter, 4, Roman 4, 1976, page 3. Benedict Fabre-Müller, Pierre Le Bouleux, and Philippe Rothstein, Léon de Rosny, 1837 to 1914, De l'Orient à l'Amérique, Villeneuve d'Ascq, Presse universitaire du Septentrion, 2014. All right, next page. Wartime Studies. In 1941, not only had the war in Europe left Britain isolated, but also there was a growing sense of the inevitability of war with Japan. In the United States, the shortage of Japanese speakers had already begun to cause alarm. In 1940, the US Navy had only 12 officers with a good knowledge of Japanese, so efforts were made to identify civilians with suitable knowledge that could be drawn upon, and then to introduce language courses for naval officers. SOAS had already been making efforts in 1939 and again in 1941 to draw the attention of the War Office to the need to anticipate any language needs in the case of war with Japan, but to no avail. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 brought the United States into the Second World War and symbolically marks the beginning of the Pacific War. However, shortly before the attack on Pearl Harbor, although seemingly on the following day, owing to the effect of the international dateline, Japanese troops launched their invasion of Malaya, and some hours later they attacked Hong Kong. The invasion of these two British colonies was followed by the sinking of the battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse on the 10th of December 1941, the surrender of the colonial authorities in Hong Kong on 25th December 1941, and the surrender of the colonial authorities in Singapore on 16th February 1942. It was at this point that Britain woke up to its woeful deficiencies in Japanese expertise. The first to act was the Government Code and Cipher School, GC&CS, renamed Government Communications Headquarters in 1946. That's GCHQ, which is still in Cheltenham, I think, or is now in Cheltenham anyway, which had been established in Bletchley Park in 1938. In December 1941, Colonel John Tiltman, 1894 to 1982, one of Britain's leading cryptanalysts, proposed the creation of a special Japanese school at the Inter-Service Special Intelligence School at Bedford. Tiltman was at this time head of the military section at GC&CS, and from 1933 he had in fact been working on Japanese diplomatic codes with some success. In June 1939, footnotes, number 33, as reported in the New York Times, 12th of December 1943. I think that's a quotation again. And 34, National Archives, ED 54/123, Ralph Turner, Director of SOAS to Board of Education, 11th of February 1942. So starting the final sentence of this page again, Tiltman was at this time head of the military section at GC&CS, and from 1933 he had in fact been working on Japanese diplomatic codes with some success. In June 1939, Tiltman's team cracked one of the new Japanese naval codes. In June 1942, Tiltman explained the genesis of the Bedford Japanese School. Qualified Japanese interpreters whom I consulted criticized the idea on the grounds that, owing to the extreme complexity of the language and very large number of Chinese characters to be memorized, responsible translation could not be expected of students who had not studied the language for at least 3 years. It seemed to me, however, that an effective result might be achieved if students at the most receptive age were carefully chosen, and if the scope of the course were severely limited to our immediate requirements. After consultation with senior members of Oxford and Cambridge universities, I became convinced that the most suitable material for the experiment would be carefully selected classical scholars between the ages of 18 and 20. I formed the opinion that, other things being equal, the discipline of training in the classics would be of more value for the desired purpose than modern language training, with the added advantage that the classical qualifications had no other immediate value for the war effort. Footnote 36 below. The qualified interpreters Tiltman consulted were most likely qualified Army or Navy interpreters who had usually themselves undergone a 3-year period in Japan as language officers. The view that 3 years were needed was shared by the embassy in Tokyo, as Craigie wrote in 1838. The experience of this embassy has led to the conclusion that 3 years is the minimum period during which even reasonable proficiency in the Japanese language can be attained, and then only as a result of very serious application. Although it has been commonly assumed and often stated that it was SOAS he consulted, Tiltman's own account gives the lie to this. The person he chose to run the courses was Captain Oswald Tuck, Royal Navy, who has already been mentioned above, note 38. So we've got footnotes here. Number 35, Ralph Erskine and Peter Freeman, Brigadier John Tiltman, one of Britain's finest cryptologists, Cryptologia 27, 2003, pages 295 to 296. Footnote 36, National Archives, HW 67/3, TypeScript, the Japanese language course at Bedford by John Tiltman, dated 26 June 1942. 37, National Archives, FO 371/22192, item 4200 on following 197 to 200. Craigie to Lord Halifax, 19th of March 1938. And footnote 38, C. Sue Jarvis, Captain Oswald Tuck, R.N., 1876 to 1950, and the Bedford Japanese School in Kortatsi, edited BJBP, Volume 5, pages 196 to 208. Jarvis assumes that it was SOAS that Tiltman consulted. Okay, start at the bottom of the page, the main text again. The person he chose to run the courses was Captain Oswald Tuck, R.N., who has already been mentioned above. By this time, he was already 65 years old and had last been in Japan in 1909 as assistant to the naval attaché in Tokyo. One of the most capable students on the first course, Eric Seidel, I suppose that's Seidel and not Keedle, 1921 to 1979, was retained to help Tuck teach the subsequent courses. In 1947, he was to become the first lecturer in Japanese at Cambridge. In all, 11 six-month courses were run at the Bedford School, and 225 men and women were trained there. At first, young students of classics from Oxford and Cambridge were chosen, but some came from other backgrounds, and for the later courses, some were recruited straight from school. The students at the Bedford School were not told that they were learning Japanese for cryptographic work, but it gradually dawned on them when they were given decrypts or intercepted messages sent in Japanese Morse code to translate. Here is an example of the kind of text they had to get to grips with. Message sent from Sofia to Budapest on 7th December 1942 by a Japanese diplomat. Shu kompan kichosu koko ni atoku zayochu no gokonjo shashi setsu ni gokensho inoru sakakibara. This does not make a lot of sense, even to seasoned students of Japanese! Exclamation mark. The word breaks were inserted by those transcribing the message who did not know Japanese. This is how Patrick Field, a student on the 8th course, translated it after less than 6 months studying Japanese. I am just returning home. I hereby warmly thank you for your kindness to me while I have been in Europe. I earnestly hope you are well. Sakakibara. He had been taught to deal with the bizarre word breaks and the truncated style of military messages and had managed to produce an accurate translation. Gosh, well done. After completing their course, the students were sent to Bletchley Park, where they were initiated into the mysteries of decryption. Some stayed at Bletchley Park for the remainder of the war. So, footnote 39, personal papers of Patrick Field, Bishop Stortford. I am indebted to Mr. Field for his hospitality and willingness to share his papers with me. Okay. Some stayed at Bletchley Park for the remainder of the war, while others were posted to the so-called Wireless Experimental Centre at Delhi, which was really a Bletchley Park outpost, or the listening and decrypting stations in Kilindini, Mombasa, HMS Anderson outside Colombo, now Sri Lanka, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, or Australia. Most of them were engaged not only in translating decrypted messages, but also in decrypting the original messages. In later life, some of the students made contributions to Japanese studies, such as David Bentliff, 1926 to still alive, who later worked as a civil servant and on retirement became a senior lecturer in Japanese at the Polytechnic of Central London, now the University of Westminster. Geoffrey Bowness, 1923 to 2011, who in 1954 became the first lecturer in Japanese at Oxford and then was the foundation professor of Japanese studies at Sheffield University, 1965 to 1980, and Eric Seidel, who has already been mentioned. There were many others, however, who have achieved distinction in other fields, but for most of all, or all of their lives, were obliged by the Official Secrets Act to make no mention of their Japanese studies or their work at Bletchley Park. Amongst them are the following: Michael Dummett, FBA, 1925 to 2011, who became Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford; David Hawkes, 1923 to 2009, who became Professor of Chinese at Oxford; Sir Hugh Lloyd-Jones, FBA, 1922 to 2009, who became Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford; Michael Lowe, or Lowe, I think, 1922, still alive, who taught Chinese at Cambridge for many years; Denise Newman, 1924, still alive, who became a champion diver and swimmer and took part in the 1948 London Olympics; Wilfred Noyce, 1917 to 1962, who was a member of the successful 1953 Everest expedition and died climbing in the Pamirs; Donald Russell, FBA, 1922, still alive, who became Professor of Classical Literature at Oxford; Michael Screech, FBA, 1926, still alive. This is at the time of writing, obviously, by the author, who became Professor of French at University College London; William Skillend, 1926 to 2010, who became Professor of Korean at SOAS; Peter Stein, FBA, 1926, still alive, who was Regius Professor of Civil Law at Cambridge; and Maurice Wiles, FBA, 1923 to 2005, who was Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford. Although the Bedford Japanese School worked hard to provide Japanese linguists for Bletchley Park, there was always a need for more. As a consequence, the Naval Section in Bletchley Park in 1943 began running its own short courses for its cryptographers, including many from the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRENS. Among those on the first course was a WREN officer, E.J.W. Kirby, who already had a command of colloquial Japanese, presumably from residence in Japan, while most of those on the second course were WRENs. The course was taught by John Lloyd, 1914 to 1982, who had joined the Japan Consular Service in 1937 and made use of a specially printed booklet entitled The Elements of Written Japanese by Arthur Cooper. Cooper had lived in Japan for some time, had worked in intelligence in Singapore, and somehow managed to escape to Australia after the fall of Singapore and make his way back to England. Although the courses were designed to produce linguists with no more than a command of naval Japanese as quickly as possible, it was recognized that some knowledge of Japan was necessary to be an efficient cryptographer. To this end, the Naval Section organized a series of lectures in August 1943. These covered not only the history of the Japanese Army and Navy, but also 4 lectures on the history of Japan given by Captain Kennedy and lectures on Japanese culture and Japanese law by a future ambassador to Japan, Sir John Pilcher, 1912 to 1990, and Severe Redmond, 1901 to 1975, who resided in Japan from 1927 and after the war became information counselor in the United Kingdom liaison mission during the occupation. Amongst those who took these courses at Bletchley Park itself was John Chadwick, FBA, 1920 to 1998, who was later to team up with Michael Ventris to solve the puzzle of the Linear B script used to write Mycenaean Greek. Only a couple of weeks after Tiltman launched his program to prepare Japanese linguists for intelligence work at Bletchley Park, the War Office took steps to meet likely wartime needs. In January 1942, the War Office consulted the Board of Education with a view to a scheme of scholarships to provide a supply of young men with expertise in Chinese, Japanese, Turkish, and Persian. FBA, is that Fellow of the British Academy? I have a feeling it might be. Something of that along those lines. I'll just have a quick check, if you'll bear with me. FBA. Oh, well. Fellow of the British Academy. Yes, that sounds likely. All right. Footnote 40, National Archives, HW, 50/78, Jap Translators Naval Section Course. Footnote 41, Michael Smith, The Emperor's Codes, Bletchley Park's role in breaking Japan's secret ciphers, London, Dialogue 2000, pages 102 to 103. Kevin Jackson, Humphrey Jennings, London, Picador, 2004, page 75. Cooper later published translations of Chinese poetry. Footnote 42, National Archives HW 8/125, typescript copies of lectures given in August 1943 for Naval Section Japanese course, Kortatsi, Sir John Pilcher, GCMG, 1912 to 1990, in Hoare, edited BJBP, Volume 3, pages 296 to 310. Kortatsi, Sir Vere Redman, 1901 to 1975, in Nish, edited BJBP, Volume 2, pages 283 to 300. Next page, which begins with a quotation. The right policy seems to be to catch them young and teach them before the age for military service. Our idea is to pick, say, 50 boys at public or other secondary schools, aged 17 to 18, and with a marked aptitude for languages, and give them special facilities to study one of these languages at the School of Oriental Studies, while continuing their general education. With astonishing rapidity, a printed memorandum was sent in February to all head teachers seeking applications for these scholarships. Applicants had to have obtained a credit in one or more foreign languages, ancient or modern, in the school certificate examination, and they had to give an undertaking that they would be at the disposal of the government for a period of not more than 5 years after the termination of their scholarship. There were 660 applicants, far more than had been expected, and after interviews, it was decided to award more scholarships than originally planned. Of these, 27 scholarships in Japanese were awarded, although only a few had chosen Japanese. Amongst them were Sir Peter Parker, 1924 to 2002, to whose memory this book is dedicated, by the way, who later became chairman of British Rail, Patrick O'Neill, 1924 to 2012, who was later to become Professor of Japanese at SOAS, and Ronald Dore, FBA, the Distinguished Sociologist of Japan, Fellow of the British Academy. Okay. The students were accommodated in Dulwich College and took their courses at SOAS and have been known as the Dulwich Boys ever since. On the 1st of May 1942, the Dulwich Boys began their courses at SOAS, with 19 months allowed for those doing Japanese or Chinese. SOAS at the time had 3 teachers of Japanese: Yoshitake Saburo, a linguist who worked on both Mongolian and Japanese; Commander N.E. Eismunger, a retired naval officer who had, and then we have the footnotes, 43 National Archives ED 54/123, W.H. Otley, War Office to Board of Education, 17th of January 1942. 44 National Archives ED 54/123, printed memorandum. 45 National Archives ED 54/123, Scholarships in Oriental Languages, 1942, Board of Education Report, prepared 31st of March 1942. State Scholarship Courses, Japanese Report, March 31st, 1943. Typescript, Dulwich students finally agreed division of Chinese and Japanese students between the 3 services, 4343. Typescript. 46, for a more detailed account, see Satow Oba, The Japanese War, London University's World War II Secret Teaching Program and the Expert Sent to Help Beat Japan, translated by Anne Kaneko, Folkestone Japan Library, 1995. The sources used in the book and in the original Japanese version are not fully made clear. All right, so continuing at the bottom of this page, Commander N.E. Eismunger, a retired naval officer who had published The Elements of Japanese Writing in 1929, and Frank Daniels, who had taught English in Otaru, Hokkaido. Daniels' wife Otome was also appointed a temporary lecturer in March 1942, and a number of other temporary appointments were made to deal with the influx of scholarship students, including Major General Piggott, Mr. John Pilcher, and three men with Japanese names who seem to have been Nisei, people of Japanese descent, seconded from the Canadian Army. There were also two Japanese London-based journalists, Matsukawa Baikin and Yanada Senji, who were released from internment to act as teachers. The students finished their course in late 1943, and by 1944 most of them were in India, employed either in SEATIC, CETIC, Southeast Asia Translation and Interrogation Center, where Japanese translators and interpreters from the three services were employed, or in the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, India. In addition to the Dulwich boys, there were many other courses run at SOAS for... Whoops, sorry. In addition to the Dulwich boys, there were many other courses run at SOAS for serving members of the armed forces, although precise numbers are not available. In 1941 to 1942, there were 295 part-time and 88 occasional service students taking courses in Chinese, Japanese, and phonetics, and in 1942 to 1943, 162 full-time, 114 part-time, and 34 occasional students following the same courses. In 1943 to 1944, there were 212 following a Japanese course in the SOAS phonetics. And then the footnotes. 47, F.J. Daniels, Japanese Studies in the University of London and elsewhere, inaugural lecture delivered on 7th November 1962, London School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, 1963, pages 18 to 19. On the wartime staff and students, see also Daniels, Japanese Studies in England and Japan, Bulletin of the Japan Society of London, 3, 1951, pages 15 to 21. Footnote 48, on Frank and Otome Daniels, see Oba, the Japanese War, pages 17 to 19, 24 to 25, and Ronald Dore, Frank and Otome Daniels, in Nish edited BJBP Volume 1, pages 268 to 278. For the additions to the staff, see Report of the Governing Body, Statement of Accounts and Departmental Reports for the year ending 31st July 1942, SOAS 1942, page 41. Later in 1942, they were joined by Frank Hawley and others. Report of the Governing Body, Statement of Accounts and Departmental Reports for the year ending 31st July 1943, SOAS 1943, pages 7, 41, 43. For the three Japanese Canadians, see Report of the Governing Body, Statement of Accounts and Departmental Reports for the year ending 31st July 1946, SOAS 1946, page 55. On Piggott, see Anthony Best, Major General FSG Piggott, 1883 to 1966, in Hugh Kotatsi, in edited BJBP, Volume 8, Leiden, Global Oriental, 2013, pages 102 to 116. Footnote 49, Collected Writings of P.G. O'Neill, Richmond, Japan Library, 2001, page 2. Footnote 50, according to the Scarborough Report, 850 service students were sent to SOAS from 1942 onwards, but this figure appears to include those studying Chinese. Reports of the Interdepartmental Commission of Inquiry on Oriental, Slavonic, East European and African Studies, London, His Majesty's Stationery Office, 1947, page 103. I think that's the end of that page, is it? Yes, looks like it, yes. So I'll just finish once more read that. In 1941 to 1942, there were 295 part-time and 88 occasional service students taking courses in Chinese, Japanese, and phonetics. And in 1942 to 1943, 162 full-time, 114 part-time, and 34 occasional students following the same courses. In 1943 to 1944, there were 212 following a Japanese course in the SOAS phonetics department. The phonetics course used records which had been specially prepared with sentences of increasing difficulty but exclusively of military content, such as Bakugeki Kaishi Yote Jikoku Shirase, information on the expected time when bombing is to commence. They were intended to train students to be able to listen to live, clear broadcasts from airplanes. In addition to the phonetics courses, there were separate courses for interrogators and for translators, both of which lasted 12 to 18 months. There were more than a dozen teachers, including John Firth, 1890 to 1960, who was later to become the first professor of general linguistics in the UK at SOAS, Kenneth Strong, who was later to teach Japanese literature at SOAS, and Eileen Evans, who taught in the phonetics department and compiled a detailed guide to the contents of the records, which was labelled Secret. Among the hundreds of students of these SOAS courses were many who achieved eminence in later life. The two Dulwich boys, Sir Peter Parker and Ronald Dore, have already been mentioned, but there were many others. Lewis Allen, 1922 to 1991, served in Burma during the war after studying Japanese at SOAS and later taught French at Durham while playing a leading role in efforts to reconcile former combatants. Carmen Blacker, FBA, 1924 to 2009, who had already been studying Japanese before the war with Major General Piggott, did one of the SOAS courses before going on the Bletchley Park course, I suppose. Later, she was to teach at Cambridge University and achieved fame with her study of religious practices in rural Japan, the Catalpa Bow, 1975. Sir Hugh Kortatsi, co-editor of this volume, who completed a 16-month course at SOAS in December 1944, was posted to India and then served at the Southeast Asia Translating and Interrogation Center in Singapore before going to Japan in 1946, became British ambassador in Tokyo in 1980, and then we got some footnotes again. Footnote 51, SOAS archives, SOAS/reg/01/01/01. Footnote 52, Bletchley Park Archives, uncatalogued item, handbook to the records, typescript prepared in 1944. Footnote 53, Kortatsi, Japan and Back and Places Elsewhere, a memoir, Folkestone Global Oriental, 1998, pages 18 to 19. Footnote 54, SOAS archives, SOAS/reg/010101. Footnote 55, Philida Purvis, Lewis Allen, 1922 to 91, and Japan in Kortatsi ed. BJBP, Volume 5, pages 344 to 357. And 56, referring to Carmen Blacker, see her entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. All right, so yes, let's finish, read the last sentence again from this page. So Hugh Kortatsi, who completed a 16-month course at SOAS in December 1944, was posted to India and then served at the Southeast Asia Translating and Interrogation Center in Singapore before going to Japan in 1946, became British ambassador in Tokyo in 1980, and then had a second career as the author of many books on Japan. Peter Laslett, FBA, 1915 to 2001, was recruited to Bletchley Park and later served in Washington before becoming a historian at Cambridge. He became famous for his book, The World War We Have Lost, England Before the Industrial Age, 1985. Guy de Mowbray, I suppose, 1925 to 2015, was a Dulwich boy and was one of the first Allied soldiers to reach Singapore after the Japanese surrender, where he found both his parents alive. Later, he became chief economist at the Bank of England, and after his retirement and death of his wife, he published a number of recipe books. Some learnt their Japanese in India, for a course was established in Simla, which was later transferred to Karachi. Ian Nish, later to be professor at the London School of Economics, and famous for his studies of the Anglo-Japanese alliance and the Russo-Japanese War, was dispatched to India to learn Japanese and later took part in the occupation, as did many other graduates of the various Japanese courses in Britain. Those who learnt their Japanese as part of the war effort found themselves using their knowledge of the language in a variety of ways. Some found themselves translating captured documents or decrypts, while others listened to clear wireless transmissions or interrogated prisoners of war or, after the war, suspected war criminals. In the cryptographic war, it is inevitably the cryptographers who have attracted the most attention, but without translators, the decrypts would have had no meaning. The role of the translators has long been a forgotten part of the story. They are not even mentioned in Boyd's study of the decrypted messages sent by Oshima Hiroshi, 1886 to 1975, who was entrusted by Hitler and Ribbentrop with critical intelligence that he passed on to Tokyo, not realizing that all his dispatches were being decrypted. The quantity and volume of these messages, which relayed critical information about German plans and preparations for dealing with the expected Allied invasion, placed heavy demands on the Japanese translators. And somewhere in my bookshelf, I do have Peter Kornicki's most recent book. Now just bear with me a moment. Here it is. Eavesdropping on the Emperor. Interrogators and code breakers in Britain's war with Japan, which was published in 2021 by C. Hurst and Company of London. Copyright Peter Kornicki. Okay, it's quite a thick book, as you can probably see even through the tiny window there. But that was obviously published after this article here, so he was still collecting information at this point, I think. All right, on we go. Footnotes for this page. Note 57, Guy de Mowbray, City of Human Memories, Stanhope Memoir Club, 2005, pages 75 to 76. Note 58, Vivian Kendrick, Ian Nish, The Japan Times, 18th of September 2004. 59, Carl Boyd, Hitler's Japanese Confidant, General Hiroshi Oshima and Magic Intelligence, 1941 to 1945, Lawrence, Kansas, University Press of Kansas, 1993. Okay, let's go to the next page. During the 5 years from 1942 to 1945, it is likely that there were more people studying Japanese in Britain than in any 5-year period up to the 1990s. The lives of some changed completely as their wartime experiences awakened their interests in East Asia, while others returned to the paths they had been following before 1942. And those at Bletchley Park never mentioned their studies until the 1980s. For a short while then, the intellectual and linguistic horizons of hundreds of young men and women were broadened unimaginably, but for most they contracted again after the war was over. Nevertheless, that wartime generation produced sufficient men and women whose interest in Japan was lasting to provide the first generation of post-war teachers in British universities. It was thanks to the efforts of William Beasley, Carmen Blacker, Geoffrey Bowness, Eric Seidel, Frank Daniels, Charles Dunn, John McEwen, Ian Nish, Patrick O'Neill, Richard Storry, and others, that the growth of Japanese studies in British universities was possible at all. So, tribute paid. Post-war developments up to 1985. As early as December 1944, well before the end of the war could be safely predicted, the Foreign Office established an interdepartmental commission of inquiry on Oriental, Slavonic, East European and African studies under the chairmanship of the Earl of Scarborough. The introduction to the report Scarborough Report, which was published in 1947, made it clear what the context was in late 1944. Quotation follows. The underdeveloped state of our store of knowledge and the small numbers of our countrymen with any detailed acquaintance with the culture and economy of the people of Africa and the East stood in marked contrast to the intimacy of our contact with them in the joint struggle to save the world from a return to the Dark Ages. The demands to be made against us by the final struggle against Japan were still unknown, but it was already apparent that an excessive preoccupation with Western affairs and civilizations would prove, I'll just continue there, to be an obstacle to the effective mobilization and deployment of military power in the Far East. Such were the circumstances which gave rise to this inquiry. A significant part of our contribution to world peace is to understand and know our neighbours, both near and distant. Western and Eastern civilizations have been brought together by a revolution in communications and must not remain separated by superstition and ignorance. The East makes great efforts to know and understand the West, and our interests and traditions require that among the Western powers we, of all peoples, should reciprocate. Okay, let's just go back to the previous page to check the footnotes. Yeah, okay. So footnote number 60. Timon Screech, Professor of Art History at SOAS, studied Japanese at Oxford, and his moral tutor at St John's College was Professor Donald Russell, who has been mentioned earlier. Russell never dropped a hint that he had studied Japanese during the war. Timon Screech, Personal Communication. All right. So next we have, go back to the page we just started. All right, so the introduction went on to refer to British responsibilities towards British colonies and the dominions of Australia and New Zealand, and it is clear, therefore, that it was partly military considerations in connection with British interests in East Asia that prompted the inquiry. Nevertheless, the dangers of ignorance had clearly been driven home by the war. The remit of the inquiry was to examine the facilities offered by universities and other educational institutions in Great Britain for the study of Oriental, Slavonic, East European and African languages and culture, and the object was to make recommendations for their improvement. To this end, subcommittees were formed to look at the separate areas of study. The subcommittee focusing on Far Eastern studies consisted of scholars and diplomats with expertise on China, but evidence was submitted by 4 individuals who knew Japan well: Frank Daniels, Frank Hawley, Major General Piggott, and Sir George Sansom. After surveying current provision, the Scarborough Commission drew attention to the failure to attract students in substantial numbers and the poor government provision for the study of living Oriental languages in Britain compared with that of many other countries, both points which have not lost their edge today, more than 60 years later. These studies were, however, the report insisted, of national importance, for if we are to preserve close and intimate relations... All right, there's some footnotes here. 61, report of the Interdepartmental Commission of Inquiry on Oriental, Slavonic, East European and African Studies, London, His Majesty's Stationery Office, 1947, page 5, 62 IBID, page 5, 63 IBID, pages 78 and 172 to 5, 64 IBID, page 22. So, start again, that final sentence on this page. These studies were, however, the report insisted, of national importance, for if we are to preserve close and intimate relations with the nations of Asia, we must develop in our own country an interest in the cultures of the East. Japan was not explicitly mentioned, but given the close ties between Britain and Japan during the years of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, Japan must have been in the Commission's collective mind. The report emphasized the need for language study as the basis of scholarship, but argued that philological studies should not predominate and that there should be a balance between classical and modern studies. To achieve its aims, the Commission recommended earmarked grants to universities and a program of 195 postgraduate studentships over 5 years to encourage further study. It hoped that an academic tradition in Oriental studies would be built up, and that in schools the imagination of boys and girls would be led beyond the countries of Western Europe, but no specific recommendations for the creation of posts were made. Early in 1945, a questionnaire had been sent to universities, and, in connection with the study of Japan, SOAS had made an ambitious proposal for the expansion of the study of China, Japan and Korea, while Cambridge had asked for a lecturer in Japanese, but that was all. Perhaps because Britain was still at war with Japan, no other bids specifically for the study of Japan were made, though St Andrews, Manchester and Liverpool all expressed an interest in Far Eastern studies. As a result of the Scarborough Report, the teaching of Japanese at SOAS gradually expanded after the end of the war, and in 1947 a lectureship in Japanese was created at Cambridge, which was followed by 2 further lectureships by 1950. Elsewhere, there were few developments until somewhat later. Those who were appointed to teaching positions in Japanese studies as a result of the Scarborough Report were men and women who, for the most part, had learnt their Japanese during the war. The one exception was SOAS, where many of the staff had been busily occupied during the war teaching Japanese for the war effort. At Cambridge, the 3 posts were first held by Eric Seidel, John McEwen, who was one of the Dulwich boys, and Donald Keene, who had learnt his Japanese in the U.S. Navy Japanese Language School at Boulder, Colorado. Very famous Japanologist, Donald Keene. Footnote 65, IBID, pages 24 to 26, and 66, IBID, pages 62, 69 to 70, and 103. On to the next page. Geoffrey Bowness was a typical case. He had gone up to Oxford with a scholarship in classics at the Queen's College, but was recruited to learn Japanese along with many other young classicists at the Bedford School of Japanese. From there, he was sent to Bletchley Park, where he was assigned to the section dealing with the Japanese military codes. But after a while, along with several of his classmates, he was sent out to the Wireless Experimental Centre in Delhi. This innocuous name concealed the real purpose of this Bletchley Park outpost, which was monitoring Japanese wireless traffic, decrypting it, and translating the messages. After the war was over, Bowness returned to Oxford in 1946 to complete his degree in classics, but then he did a degree in Chinese, followed by 2 years in Kyoto. In 1954, he was appointed to a lectureship in Chinese and Japanese at Oxford, and this marks the beginning of the undergraduate course in Japanese there. By 1960, the University Grants Committee considered that it was time for an assessment of the progress made in studies of Asia and Africa, and appointed a subcommittee under Sir William Hayter, a former British ambassador to the Soviet Union. The Hayter report, which was published in 1961, expressed disappointment in developments since 1947. Although numbers of staff had increased, student numbers were still low, and the system of earmarked grants had come to an end in 1952. What is more, the report considered the British educational system anachronistic in its focus on Western Europe, North America, and the Commonwealth. The report, which contains a useful survey of developments since 1947, was based not only on an assessment of Britain's needs, but also on the findings of a visit to universities in the United States and Canada. Already the report expressed its fear of a drain of teachers to American universities. The report argued that the universities should now be encouraged to pay more attention to studies related to Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, and not so much in language departments as in the history, geography, law, economics, and other social science departments. To this end, and then we've got 3 footnotes, 67, obituary in The Guardian, 13th of March 2011, 68, report of the Subcommittee on Oriental, Slavonic, East European and African Studies, London, Her Majesty's Stationery Office, 1961, page 3, and 69, Ibid, page 61. All right, start again, the final sentence of this page. The report argued that the universities should now be encouraged to pay more attention to studies related to Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, and not so much in language departments as in the history, geography, law, economics, and other social science departments. To this end, it recommended the creation of a fund that universities could draw upon to make new appointments of these kinds, and argued for more teaching of spoken languages and for the cooperative buying and cataloguing of books. Many of the recommendations made by the Hayter report made a lot of sense, but it was to be many years before they were implemented. For example, in the case of library resources, the Japan Library Group was founded in 1966, but it was only from 1975 that it was able to operate a cooperative acquisition scheme, and that depended on financial help from the Japan Foundation Endowment Committee. In the case of Japanese studies, which in the Hayter report was subsumed under Far Eastern studies, the subcommittee did not see much room for expanding language provision beyond SOAS, Oxford and Cambridge, with the exception of Durham, but it did wish to see the development of centres of area studies, including the Far East. The only such proposal in the case of Japanese studies came rather fortuitously from Sheffield University, and this development dramatically changed the landscape of Japanese studies in Britain. A Centre for Japanese Studies was created in 1963 with funds made available by the University Grants Committee, UGC, and in 1966, Geoffrey Bowness was appointed Professor of Japanese. But the real innovation was to introduce courses linking language study to the study of history, economics, and the social sciences. The establishment of the Centre for Japanese Studies at Sheffield and the title of Geoffrey Bowness' inaugural lecture in 1966, From Japanology to Japanese Studies, were emblematic of a shift that was then still taking place. Bowness outlined the difference between the two terms, describing Japanology as almost pretentious in its breadth, inward-looking, and sometimes a little amateurish. On the other hand, Japanese studies, he insisted, must be professional, specialist, permitting concentration on a concise sphere of interest and directed to a comparative, multidisciplinary, and then we have 3 footnotes, 70, Ibid, pages 68 to 70, 87, 106 to 107, Note 71, Ibid, pages 83, page 87. Note 72, Bowness from Japanology to Japanese Studies, inaugural lecture, University of Sheffield, 14th of December, 1966, page 6. The lecture is reprinted in Bowness Japanese Journeys, Writings and Recollections, Folkestone, Global Oriental, 2005, pages 228 to 246. So yes, Japanology was the sort of thing that Ernest Satow was a pioneer in the 19th century, but it wasn't his full-time work. He wasn't doing it as a qua professional as such. It was something he was required to do as part of his job, but quite amateurish in some ways. Okay, directed to a comparative. So, on the other hand, Japanese studies, he insisted, must be professional, specialist, permitting concentration on a concise sphere of interest and directed to a comparative, multidisciplinary treatment of Japan. He was really advocating a change in outlook more than anything else, but by the 1970s, the term Japanese studies had become standard with the foundation of the European Association for Japanese Studies in 1973. of which, by the way, Peter Kornicki is a past president, of the British Association for Japanese Studies in 1974, and in the United States of the Journal of Japanese Studies also in 1974. The term was not altogether new, however. It had been used in 1937 by the Kokusai Bunka Shinkokai. In 1947, the University of Michigan had established a Center for Japanese Studies, and in 1963, Daniels had used the term in his inaugural lecture. The increasingly common use of Japanese studies from the 1970s onwards, however, did signify the coming of an age of an area studies focus on Japan, with due weight given to disciplinary approaches. Just how important the change of terminology was is perhaps debatable. The equivalents of Japanese studies in German and French, Japanstudien and Études japonaises, are relatively recent coinages and have not replaced the older terms Japanologie or Japanistik in Germany and Japanologie in France. This has not, however, deterred French and German scholars from pursuing disciplinary studies of Japan. So it's really just nomenclature, I suppose. The hallmark of Japanese studies has been an expansion beyond the earlier focus on language, literature, and history to include anthropology and the social and political sciences. The lead set by Sheffield was later followed by other universities such as Stirling and Essex. And the Nissan benefaction at Oxford enabled the creation of new posts in the social and political sciences there in the 1970s. In Cambridge, where the study of Japan almost came to an end in the 1980s, it was in the late 1980s and 1990s that new posts were created in Japanese society, politics, and international relations. SOAS is a slightly different case, as there already were Japan specialists in some of the social and political science departments, and much the same was true of the London School of Economics. Although the study of Japan remained concentrated in departments of Japanese studies, by the early 1980s there were not only, and then we have footnotes, 73 Ibid, page 12, 74, A Guide to Japanese Studies, Orientation in the Study of Japanese History, Buddhism, Shintoism, Art, Classic Literature, Modern Literature, Tokyo Kokusai Bunka Shinkokai, 1937, Frank J. Daniels, Japanese Studies in the University of London and elsewhere. Although the study of Japan remained concentrated in departments of Japanese studies, by the early 1980s there were not only new developments based in non-language departments, but also growing outreach, with courses on the history, economy, sociology, and politics of Japan being offered to those with no knowledge of the language. This was, at the undergraduate level, the beginning of a process of reducing the Eurocentric bias of disciplinary courses, which tended to focus on Europe and North America. It was during the same decade that courses on Japanese and Japanese studies began to mushroom. In 1980, the Scottish Centre for Japanese Studies was founded as part of the Scottish Business School, and in 1984, a Japanese business policy unit was founded at the University of Warwick, with plans to incorporate it in a new East Asia Centre. Durham added Japanese studies to Chinese studies in the 1980s, and the Contemporary Japan Centre at the University of Essex was founded in 1989 with the aim that Japan should not be studied simply sui generis, but that students need to combine a solid training in social scientific approaches, theories, and methodologies with a good control of language sources, written and spoken, in their approach to the country. Post-war developments after 1985. Although the Hayter Report tried to hammer home some much-needed lessons, and it did at least make possible the creation of the new centre at Sheffield, its recommendations for a special fund for posts, for 100 earmarked postgraduate awards, and for 6 or 8 new centres of area studies were not implemented. What is more, its continued use of terms such as Far Eastern studies rather undermined the attempt to present the study of East Asia as urgent and pressing for Britain. It was only the third and last of the 3 major post-war inquiries into Asian and African studies in Britain that adopted different, less Eurocentric language. This was another report prepared for the University Grants Committee, this time under the chairmanship of Sir Peter Parker, 1924 to 2002, who had been a Dulwich boy studying Japanese in 1942. Footnotes 75, Roger Goodman and Ian Neary edited Case Studies on Human Rights in Japan, second printing, London, Curzon Press, 2003, page 10, Roman 10. Footnote 76, Report of the Subcommittee on Oriental, Slavonic, East European and African Studies, page 4. All right, rereading the final sentence of this page. This was another report prepared for the University Grants Committee, this time under the chairmanship of Sir Peter Parker, 1924-2002, who had been a Dulwich boy studying Japanese in 1942. and had gone on to become chairman of the board of British Rail. The so-called Parker Report was properly entitled Speaking for the Future, a review of the requirements of diplomacy and commerce for Asian and African languages and area studies, and it was published in 1986. In the 25 years since the publication of the Hayter Report, decolonisation had mostly run its course, and Britain's influence in the world was undeniably declining, but it was precisely for this reason, Parker argued, that Britain's commercial and diplomatic efforts needed ever more mastery of the languages and cultures of the world. A government which is concerned for the development of Britain's overseas trade must therefore be prepared to take a view of the long-term languages and areas studies provision needs on behalf of business. However, in a section entitled The System at Risk, Parker argued that the system of education in Asian and African studies, whose benefits the country is still enjoying, is already gradually breaking down. In response to the Parker Report, the University Grants Committee agreed to fund posts in a variety of subject areas covered in the report. The special factor funding, as it was called, ran for 5 academic years from 1987 to 1992 and was mainly used for the creation of new posts, around half of which were in Arabic, Chinese or Japanese, which Parker considered were likely to remain of both major political and commercial significance. Simultaneously, additional funding was made available to SOAS outside the Parker initiatives. Because of its specialist nature, it was funded substantially by special factor allocation. Some of the new posts were created in existing centres and some in new centres. The new centres included the Cardiff Japanese Studies Centre, which was established in 1989 as part of the Cardiff Business School, and Leeds, where Japanese studies was grafted onto the existing provision in Chinese and Mongolian studies to create a new department of East Asian studies. Footnotes. Number 77, Speaking for the Future, a review of the requirements of diplomacy and commerce for Asian and African languages and area studies, 1986, page 8. Footnote 78, IBID, page 11. Footnote 79, evaluation of HEFCE, HEFCE, funding for minority subjects, a report to HEFCE, that's higher education funding, something or other, CE, I'm not sure, by Universitas, 2005, page 6. And there's the URL, which I will not read. Footnote 80, IBID, page 6. See also National Archives, UGC 30/1, the Parker Report, and SOAS, 12th of March 1990. This file is marked closed until 2022, exclamation mark. All right, I'm going to continue at the bottom of the page. The new posts in Japanese studies created when the Parker Report was implemented were distributed as follows. Cambridge 1, Newcastle 2, 1 being a chair, Oxford 1, Sheffield 2, SOAS 3, Stirling 2. The UGC, Universities Grants Committee, subsequently made allocations to Cardiff for 3.5 posts and to Essex for 2 posts in the expectation that both institutions will raise a considerable proportion of their funding from non-UGC sources. The 1990s were undoubtedly a time of growth, at least in the number and range of institutions teaching on Japan in one way or another. A survey of Japanese studies in British universities carried out in 1996 to 1997 revealed the development of courses in Japanese studies as an option or a minor subject at Aston, Birmingham, Bradford, Nottingham, Ulster and other universities, as well as King's College London, the University of Central Lancashire and King Alfred's College of Higher Education. Meanwhile, Japanese studies was being firmly established in Essex University, where Japanese had been available as an option since 1983 and then became a postgraduate degree subject. The chair in Japanese was funded by Sanwa Bank. Japanese studies was also flourishing at Durham, with Gina Barnes as NSK Professor of Japanese. Between 1993 and 1999, 6 posts in Japanese were created there, one as a result of funds received from the Japan Foundation. Furthermore, the Department of Trade and Industry, DTI, launched a Japanese training initiative in 1989 in the hope of doubling the numbers of graduates in Japanese and thereby increasing the numbers of people in UK industry able to do business effectively with Japan. A key part of this was to make sure that all students spent a substantial period in Japan. The DTI supported 4 new postgraduate courses at SOAS, Stirling, Bath, and the Northwest Centre for Japanese Studies at Manchester, and enhanced existing courses at Sheffield, Essex, and Liverpool. Unfortunately, however, the funding came to an end in 1994, as has happened so often. 3 footnotes. 81. National Archives, UGC 30/1, University Grants Committee, Summary of Provision for Japanese Undated Typescript circa 1990. Footnote 82. Japanese degree courses in universities and other tertiary education institutions in the United Kingdom, 1996-7. London, Japan Foundation and Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, 1997. Footnote 83. The DTI, Japanese Language Training Initiative, JLT, Evaluation, Typescript, ND, not dated, circa 1993. Move on to the next page. In Scotland, courses on Japan were taught at Stirling in the early 1970s by James Valentine in sociology and social anthropology and Jean-Pierre Lehmann in history. A centre for providing language courses and business services to the public was set up, but there was no further development until a Japan Foundation staff expansion post was created in Japanese religions in the early 1980s, and this was held for 6 years by Dr. Brian Bocking. In 1987, Stirling was awarded 2 posts for the establishment of Japanese degrees from the Funding Council, and it was also decided to appoint, in addition, a director and professorial post. Ian Gow was appointed to the directorship, and the other 2 posts were filled by Ian Reeder and Tessa Carroll. Joint degrees were established quickly in a number of subjects, including business studies and languages. NatWest Bank provided funding for the chair in Japanese studies, which was held by Ian Gow, and Stirling also won major funding for the Masters in Japanese Business Programme, funded by the Department of Trade and Industry. Approval was obtained from the Secretary of State for Scotland to name the Stirling Centre the Scottish Centre for Japanese Studies. Ian Gow was succeeded by Joseph Moran and John Crump, but student numbers dropped, posts were not renewed, and then joint degrees and the master's degree were also dropped. Anybody wondering what happened to all these courses need only turn to the subsequent survey carried out in 2001-2002, which revealed that most of these courses had shrunk or been discontinued. In 1997, Essex discontinued the teaching of Japanese at undergraduate level in any form because it was no longer economically viable. The Scottish Centre for Japanese Studies ceased to exist in 1999. Quite a difference there. And from 2002, there was a phased withdrawal of all Japanese courses there and at Ulster. At Durham, the Department of East Asian Studies was axed in 2003 in spite of widespread and high-level protests. Oh dear, oh dear. In 1991, the University Funding Council, UFC, the successor to the University Grants Committee, had introduced a programme of minority subject funding to protect imperiled, and we have footnotes, 84 Japanese degree courses, 2001 to 2002, a directory of Japanese degree courses in universities and other tertiary education institutions in the United Kingdom, London, Japan Foundation and Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, 2002, pages 106, 211, 224. Footnote 85, Times Higher Education Supplement, 3rd of October, 2003. All right. In 1991, the University Funding Council, UFC, the successor to the University Grants Committee, had introduced a programme of minority subject funding to protect imperiled subjects and languages. As a result, courses in Japanese and other languages enjoyed some budgetary protection. In 1992, the UFC was succeeded by 4 new funding councils. The Higher Education Funding Council for England, HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales and the Scottish Funding Council at first maintained the minority subject funding. Only HEFCE persevered with the scheme, however, while the Welsh and Scottish funding councils phased out minority subject funding. Although the minority subject funding arrangements were reviewed and renewed in 1994 and 1999, Japanese and Chinese were no longer considered minority subjects and were therefore not eligible for further tranches of funding. In the first decade of the 21st century, however, a new initiative for language-based area studies was launched by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Scottish Funding Council and HEFCE. The objective was to enhance national understanding of the Arabic-speaking world, China, Japan and Eastern Europe, including the former Soviet Union, by creating new centres of excellence staffed by researchers who combined the necessary language skills and disciplinary expertise. In 2006, 5 new centres were created, selected from a large number of bids, and they were funded at a combined cost of £15 million. but the only one with a component related to Japanese studies was the White Rose East Asia Centre, which was hosted by the University of Leeds with the University of Sheffield as a partner institution. The White Rose East Asia Centre epitomized a new regional focus on East Asia rather than just on Japan. This new focus is also to be found in the Universities of Leeds, Sheffield and Cambridge, where new departmental nomenclature has sought to represent this shift in approach. The present and the future. Before I read that, there's a footnote, 86, evaluation of HEFKE funding for minority subjects, downloadable from the URL there, page 30, and PASIM. The present and the future, as the essays contained in this volume show. There is much to celebrate in the growth of Japanese studies in Britain since 1945 and particularly over the last 30 years. This is true both in terms of scholarship and in terms of the development and growth of Japanese studies courses. The scholarship is evident from the publications mentioned in the essays, but it is worth remembering that not a few British scholars working on Japan have done so outside Britain. Ivan Morris, 1925 to 1976, taught at Columbia for many years. Hamish Ion, a contributor to this volume, teaches at the Royal Military College of Canada, and Martin Colcott at Princeton University. Conversely, many who were born and educated outside Britain have contributed to Japanese studies in Britain. Particularly important have been the talented language teachers who have brought their expertise in the teaching of Japanese as a second language to British universities, and the librarians who have curated some of the best collections of Japanese books in Europe. There have also been teachers such as the Americans Donald Keene, who taught at Cambridge from 1948 to 1954, and Andrew Gerstle, who has contributed to this volume and is professor of Japanese at SOAS, and many others from Austria, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United States, and elsewhere, some of whom have done their graduate work in Britain. Collectively, they have enriched Japanese studies in Britain by bringing different approaches and teaching methodologies with them, but it is a concern that few British undergraduates go on to undertake graduate work and seek academic employment in Britain. As for Japanese studies courses, graduates now typically leave university not only with language skills honed during a year's residence in Japan, but also with disciplinary expertise in one or more of a number of disciplines ranging from literature to business studies, anthropology, and the social sciences to classical Japanese. In spite of these successes, we need to remember that Japanese is taught in an ever-changing environment for higher education in Britain, and therein lie some problems. Since 1945, Japanese studies, like other Asian, African, and East European studies, have benefited from the encouragement given by the Scarborough, Hayter, and Parker reports. But the funding that resulted from these reports was short-lived. As Parker put it in a letter to Sir Peter Swinnerton Dyer, chairman of the UGC, on the 18th of February 1986, it cannot be right that every other decade the country goes into a spasm of concern. I must hope that this inquiry, the latest of them, will offer an opportunity to develop a more coherent policy with stamina. Alas, that opportunity was not taken. It is true that the study of Japan has weathered the storms rather better than other subjects thanks to the extraordinary generosity of Japanese corporations, foundations, and individuals over the last couple of decades. The Japan Foundation, the Japan Foundation Endowment Committee, Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, the Nippon Foundation, the Keidan Ren and the Nissan Motor Company, Oxford, Sanwa Bank, Essex, NSK Durham, along with other individuals and charitable bodies, have underwritten posts and in other ways provided financial support that has not been forthcoming from universities or funding bodies. In addition, the Japan Society, the British Association for Japanese Studies, and the Japan Library Group have lobbied on behalf of Japanese studies, facilitated the growth of library connections, and done much else to support the study of Japan in Britain. Finally, the superb resources of the British Library and the British Museum, as well as those of many libraries, museums and art galleries around Britain, constitute a national collection of material relating to Japan that is of staggering scope and depth. We have much to be grateful for. Nevertheless, the loss of earmarked funding and the end of special treatment has made departments of Japanese studies vulnerable to the calculus of student numbers, to the rhetoric of value for money, and to the demands of the market. In the United States, on the other hand, the National Defense Education Act of 1958 has served to protect vulnerable subjects seen as of strategic value to the US, irrespective of student demand and market sustainability, but there is no such protection in Britain. Parker pointed out, by way of contrast, that by 1986, SOAS had had its income cut by 37% and had lost 25% of its academic staff, Lord, over the previous 5 years, and lamented the lack of systematic planning or of provision. Of provision. Or provision? Anyway, notes, footnotes, 87. Appendix to Parker Report, and 88. Speaking for the Future, pages 12, 78 to 80. Yes, the quotation from Sir Peter Parker was in the appendix to the Parker Report, the one at the top of the page. Okay. All right, so start the last sentence again. Parker pointed out, by way of contrast, that by 1986, SOAS had had its income cut by 37%. Gosh. And had lost 25% of its academic staff over the previous 5 years, and lamented the lack of systematic planning of provision or of monitoring of the national stock of expertise in studies of Africa and Asia. There is still no planning or monitoring on a national level, and areas of expertise have already been lost, though Chinese and Japanese studies seem safe for the time being, thanks to reasonably buoyant student numbers. Unfortunately, the protection that substantially higher student numbers would bring is unlikely to materialize in the near future. It must also be admitted that the growth of Japanese studies in the UK has not been impressive in terms of numbers of undergraduates, especially when compared with the United States, France, or Germany. The Japan Foundation has carried out regular surveys of Japanese studies in the United Kingdom, and these snapshots, taken at intervals of 5 or more years, make it possible to identify the shifts that have taken place over the last 30 years. The 1988 survey revealed that the number of undergraduates taking single honours degrees in Japanese in that year was 16, and that had risen to 56 by 1995. The projection in 1993 was that the number would rise to over 100 by 2000, though the actual number in 2001 was 58. Similarly, in the case of joint or combined honours degrees, there were 7 graduates in 1988, rising to 145 in 1995. The projection in 1993 was that this number would rise to 250 by 2000, but the actual number in 2001 was 122. It's all about the economy, isn't it? Predictions about the Japanese economy, I suppose. Since then, however, the numbers have indeed risen, and in 2015 there were 222 taking single honours degrees and 305 taking joint or combined honours degrees, but bringing the total over 500 for the first time. Oh, gosh, well done. It is clear, surely, then, that there has been slow but steady growth in student numbers. To some extent, this can be attributed to the rising numbers of pupils being exposed to the Japanese language at schools, some of whom go on to take GCSE or further qualifications in Japanese, General Certificate of Secondary Education, or further qualifications in Japanese, but other factors include the popularity of Japanese popular culture with teenagers, which has the effect of reducing the unfamiliarity of Japan. Footnotes. Number 89, Speaking for the Future, page 11. Number 90, Japanese degree courses in universities and other tertiary education institutions in the United Kingdom, 1996-7, page 13. Japanese degree courses, 2001 to 2002, page 15. Footnote 91, Japan Foundation Japanese Studies Survey, 2015, a survey of Japanese studies at university level in the UK. London, Japan Foundation, 2016, downloadable from, I shall not read that, URL, page 13. All right. I think we're coming towards the end now. In the 21st century, much of the growth has been in new centres and departments such as those at Oxford, Brookes and Leeds, and more recently the University of East Anglia and the University of Central Lancashire, among others. Altogether, 35 universities are listed in the latest Japan Foundation survey, 4 more than in the previous survey. Of these, 15 offer courses leading either to single honours or joint combined honours degrees in Japanese studies, while the rest either offer standalone modules relating to Japan or have staff and or postgraduate students working on Japan-related topics. From this, it is clear that more students than ever before are having the opportunity to include at least some study of Japan in their degree courses. The 2015 Japan Foundation survey also includes the result of a survey of undergraduates studying Japanese based on the replies of 293 respondents. These reveal that 30% were not UK nationals and that as many as 49% had undertaken some study of Japanese before going to university. Of those who had studied Japanese before, only 20% had studied at school, while 50% had studied independently. For 92% of all undergraduates, the most important factor prompting them to opt for a degree in Japanese was, unsurprisingly, the desire to learn the Japanese language. For this reason, a high degree of importance was attached to the year spent in Japan during the course. The area of Japanese studies that attracted most interest Areas of Japanese studies that attracted most interest were the language, traditional culture, and history, and the area of least interest was the Japanese economy. A particular problem for courses in Japanese studies, as for all language-based subjects in the UK, has been the steady decline in the number of boys and girls taking A-levels in languages. To some extent, this can be attributed to the removal by the Labour government in 2004 of the requirement to study a modern foreign language at Key Stage 4. This led to a major decline in the numbers taking languages at GCSE level. In 2001, 78% of Year 11 pupils took a modern foreign language, but by 2011 that had dropped to 40%. Inevitably, fewer pupils then went on to take A-level languages. More than 22,000 took A-level French in 1996, but and there's a footnote, which doesn't make much sense in isolation, but there we are, 92. IBID, pages 189, 192, 199, 201, 202, and 204, for what that's worth, referring to a previous footnote. Right. Inevitably, fewer pupils then went on to take A-level languages. More than 22,000 took A-level French in 1996, but in 2013, fewer than 10,000. Oh, my Lord. I used to teach French. At the same time, the introduction of an annual fee of £9,000 in most universities has led to an understandable reduction in the number of EU students coming to Britain. For these various reasons, most university language-based courses have experienced falling numbers of enrolments. On the other hand, the teaching of Japanese in secondary schools has become less uncommon, and major new commitments to Japanese studies were made by the University of Manchester in 2007 and the University of East Anglia in 2011, the latter building on the foundations provided by the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, SISJAC, as I call it, I hope correctly. What is more, the study of Japan, along with the study of other Asian societies, has undoubtedly contributed to the process of reducing the Eurocentric bias of disciplines such as history, the history of art, sociology, and so on. This process, of course, is still far from complete. It is far from uncommon in the UK for historians of Japan, for example, to be placed in departments of Japanese studies rather than in history departments, though this has long ceased to be the case in North America. Similarly, most departments of the history of art pay little attention to Asian art, and the same can be said of music, philosophy, and so on. This is not so in SOAS, and elsewhere there have been signs of the opening up of traditionally Eurocentric departments. The appointment of Craig Clunas, a sinologist, to the professorship of the history of art at Oxford represented a significant step in the right direction. At Nottingham, the two representatives of Japanese studies, Andrew Cobbing, a friend of mine, and Sue Townsend, are both based in the Department of History, while at Oxford Brookes, courses on Japanese society are embedded in the teaching of anthropology. In spite of the problems mentioned above, which relate mostly to undergraduate provision and the new university funding structures, in one respect, Japanese studies certainly has flourished in Britain, and that is in research and publications. Whereas before 1945, almost all writing on Japan was produced outside the universities, the balance has shifted dramatically since 1945. We have a footnote, 93. Deborah Malpass, The Decline in Uptake of A-Level Modern Foreign Languages, Literature Review in A Review of Modern Foreign Languages at A-Level, Joint Council for Qualifications, 2014, downloadable from URL. Okay, the publications of university-based scholars are mentioned in the various chapters that follow, but other contributions there certainly have been. Amongst them are the writings of two librarians, Kenneth Gardner of the British Library and Koyama Noboru of Cambridge University Library. Gardner produced a magnificent catalogue of the pre-1700 Japanese books in the British Library, while Koyama has produced well-researched books on such subjects as international marriages in Meiji Japan, Japanese tattooists and the British royal family, and the Japanese village in late 19th century London. Among the diplomats, James Hoare, who served for many years in the British Embassy in Seoul and was Britain's first diplomatic representative in Pyongyang, and Sir Hugh Kortatsi, who was British ambassador to Japan from 1980 to 1984, have both written on relations between Britain and Japan. Kortatsi has also written many historical studies, including Isles of Gold, Antique Maps of Japan, 1983, Victorians in Japan, in and around the treaty ports, 1987, Japan in late Victorian London, the Japanese native village in Knightsbridge, and the Mikado, 1885, 2009, and has been one of the most effective defenders of Japanese studies in Britain over the last 30 years, as we have seen already in previous reading of this book. In a recent lecture, Arthur Stockwin, Emeritus Professor of Japanese at Oxford, said that studying Japan, even in what we might consider an ideal world, is at best a minority pursuit, widely regarded as non-mainstream and therefore potentially expendable. In that context, he argued, those of us who study and teach about Japan ought not to be complacent and need to be ready to make the case for the need to study Japan. Japan, of course, remains today a compelling subject of study, and there is no reason to suppose that its significance on the world stage will diminish in the short or medium term. Footnote 94, Gardner, Descriptive Catalogue of Japanese Books in the British Library, printed before 1700, 1993. Koyama, Kokusai Kekkon Dai Ichigo, 1995. Nihon no Shisei to Eikoku Oshitsu, 2010. London ni Nihonjin Mura o Tsukutta Otoko, 2015. Ewing Brown, Kenneth Gardner, 1924-95, librarian and bibliographer in Kortatsi edited BJBP, Volume 7, pages 230 to 239. Footnote 95, Hoare edited Britain and Japan, 1999. Much of Hoare's work has focused on British relations with Korea. So far, 10 volumes of the series BJBP have appeared, of which the first two were edited by Ian Nish, the third by Hoare, and the remainder by Kortatsi alone. Footnote 96, J.A.A. Stockwin, The Future of Japanese Studies, A Personal Perspective, paper delivered at the Cannon Foundation in Europe Regional Fellow Meeting, EHESS, Paris, 21st of November, 2014. The changing dynamics of the Pacific Rim economy, the changes in the balance of power in East Asia, and the globalization of Japanese culture by means of translations, touring theatre companies, and the like, have all worked together to make Japan better known, worth studying, and impossible to ignore. Many will study Japan without learning the language, but how far can you go without knowledge of the language? The needs of diplomacy, business-informed journalism, and scholarship are such that the ability to converse and debate in Japanese, to make use of Japanese written documents, and to function in Japanese society are likely to remain indispensable. However, those skills are taught in the future. It will be alongside the necessary disciplinary skills, and those with the disciplinary skills will need to continue helping to remove the Eurocentric bias of so many subjects of study in the United Kingdom. And there we are. That is, we have come to the end of Peter Kornicki's chapter 1 of Japanese Studies in Britain, a Survey and History. And I will stop the share now. Yes, I don't know how long this has been. It's probably been a good hour and probably more. I felt that I was racing through it, but on the other hand, if you don't read at a reasonable speed, I think you get bogged down, and I was afraid of doing that. So that's why I tried to keep the pace up. And it's very informative, and I would like to thank Peter Kornicki for writing that and for giving me the opportunity to read it. In fact, he said that it was up to the Japan Society as they hold the copyright. But anyway, yes, it's a valuable, very valuable look at the history of Japanese studies and Japanology before it in Japan and in Britain. especially in Britain, of course, and Europe. All right. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop here and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.